Hello everyone, welcome to my Boomsday Project card review. A couple of things real quick before we get started. One, I'm a little bit late to this bandwagon, so I do have quite a few cards to go through. I do believe the first three waves of cards have gotten reviewed or released and reviewed already by other people. Up to, as you can see here, the Flobbidinous Floop, I think, was the most recent reveal. And second, why I'm doing this review stream. And it basically boils down to, I believe, my observation is that when people look at new cards, they tend to look at them through one of three lenses. And the third of that lens actually is sort of getting overlooked. That I feel like a lot of people tend to not look through cards through that third lens, but need to. And that's what I'm mostly going to try and focus on presenting here. Now, just real quick, those three lenses. One, powerful mechanics or gimmicks. For that, I'm going to talk about, like, Gadgets and Auctioneer. You know, Miracle Rogue still sort of exists. The Miracle Rogue from 2 to 3 years ago was very different from what it was now, right? And, you know, the issue with Miracle Rogue is if you don't draw your Gadgets and Auctioneers. That's why it's an okay deck, because there are 2 Gadgets and Auctioneers in the deck. But if there's only one, that has a real serious consistency problem. And that's sort of the example I'm going to use for gimmick decks, and why frequently one-of decks, or decks built around a legendary gimmick, often aren't successful. I'm not going to say always, because obviously Rizakis Priest was a huge problem. You know, you needed Kazakis, but for some reason you always, or not, was it Kazakis? No. It was Raza the Chained? Question mark? Anyway, the Priest legendary that makes your hero power free. You needed that card relatively early in your deck, and for some reason people just always had it on 5, which was a problem. But anytime that card got shuffled to your bottom 4, you were pretty miserable. And that's my point, is having a deck that relies on a one-of gimmick is often inconsistent, or runs the risk of being inconsistent, and therefore automatically introduces an element of badness. Similarly, a card that you can have 2 of, like Gadgets and Auctioneer, has an element of inconsistency in it, which is automatically bad. Though obviously a 2 of card that you're dependent on isn't as bad as a 1 of. However, that is reasons why gimmick decks, I'm gonna say the perfect example of gimmick decks are something like legendary weapon decks or quest decks. Now, quest decks cheat at being gimmicky because you always start with the gimmick in your opening hand, right? Like, how bad would Quest Warrior be if you had to draw the quest before you could start playing taunts? Pretty bad. So yeah, I do think that's also, like, I'll give you another really quick example, like Black Howl Gunspire, right? That's definitely a gimmick card. And if you combine it with something like Warpath plus Sudden Genesis, you can put out a machine gun of towers and just start nuking your opponent down. And that's funny, it's interesting, but it's not good or competitive. And I do think that's a strong emphasis of what people look for in card review streams. So, long story short, you look at a card, you say, what's a gimmick behind this that I can exploit? If I was to build a deck around this card, how would I make it good? Most of the time you're not going to, but occasionally you can. Second lens. Cards that slot well into decks that already exist. Now, thankfully, because I have this screen up, I can just use Flobbidinous Floop as an example. I'm going to review this later, but the big thing people have been going off about on this is Malygos Druid. Now, this is a fantastic card, Malygos Druid, because Malygos Druid doesn't have any way of playing Malygos and then dealing large volumes of damage with spells. Yes, it has 2 Moonfires, but that's a maximum of 12 to face. The times when Malygos Druid were most strong was when it had Living Roots, which was the capacity for 1 mana 6 to face. So then your burst was 18. 2 Moonfire. No, I'm sorry, that was 7 to face. So that would have been 19. So yeah, you could Moonfire Living Roots for 19, and that is a very different thing. I believe, was Thaurissan in that meta? I don't remember. Anyway, there were other ways to tie Malygos together with other ways of dealing damage to face. And Druid just doesn't have that option right now. It just doesn't have cheap spells that it can combine with Malygos to do a 10-mana turn. So the go-to way to tie extra mana and extra spells to Malygos currently is with the Twig of the World Tree, which is way too inconsistent. It can be removed by your opponent. It's not activated until 4 turns after you draw it. You hope you don't draw it in the bottom 5 cards of your deck, etc., etc., etc. So I do feel Malygos Druid is inconsistent because of its inability to tie extra mana and extra spells to Malygos. It doesn't have a way of cheating Malygos out or cheating out extra spells. Hypothetically, a Malygos Rogue can cheat out extra spells because it can do like Malygos for 9, Sinister Strike, Counterfeit Coin, Sinister Strike, Prep Eviscerate, Prep Eviscerate. That's a bunch of cards, but Prep lets you cheat in extra mana and spells to go along with your Malygos. Something like this just says, you just put it in your Malygos Druid deck, and it says, play your 9-mana Malygos, let it get polymorphed or killed or whatever, and nobody cares, and then next turn, play a 4-mana, 3/4 Malygos, and you have 6 mana to cast spells with. So now you can do something like Moonfire Swipe, which is going to be 21 to face. Or I suppose maybe you could run Innervates on this to make it Innervate for a second swipe. I think that's pretty ridiculous. But my point is, this is a case of a card where you say there is a deck that already exists that you simply put this into, and that deck gets quite a bit better. And I think that's a completely valid way of looking at a second lens of cards. I think that's an incredibly important way of looking at cards. But the third lens that I think people need to use when looking at cards is the family of threats type of card. And the best example I'm going to give for that right now is probably Odd Paladin. Here's the thing that throws me about Odd Paladin, and I will say this several more times through this video. The problem with Odd Paladin is that when it presses its hero power, it generates 2 1/1s. I don't really care about 2 1/1s. I don't feel threatened by 2 1/1s. The problem is that 2 1/1s on the board is a phantom of a much larger threat. I mean, this is generally true of token druids, or I'm sorry, of token decks. Always. But I will use Token Druid as another example. If your opponent plays Whispering Woods on 4, I'm talking about a Token Druid here. If he plays Whispering Woods on 4, which is usually a bad idea, and summons 7 Wisps, generally a person doesn't feel threatened by 7 1/1s. I mean, if you had no cards in hand after playing Whispering Woods, nobody would feel threatened by those 7 Wisps. The problem is that if you leave them on the board, on the next turn, your opponent is going to buff them in some way that makes them extremely problematic. So the problem isn't that there's 7 1/1s on the board. It's what your opponent is going to snowball them into the following turn. Therefore, you have to respond to them, despite the fact that they're not currently a threat. They're the threat of a threat. So, bringing us back to Odd Paladin, 2 1/1s, two Silverhand Recruits on the board isn't a threat. It is a shadow of a threat on the following turn, especially if you're up around 6-7 mana and your opponent goes, turn 7, I have 2 dudes on the board. Turn 8, I play 2 more dudes, and then I Sunkeeper to Rim. Great, those 2 2/2s, the 2 1/1s you left on the board last turn are now 2 3/3s. That sort of sucks. So you feel this constant pressure to constantly remove your opponent's 1/1s, which he gets just by pressing the hero power. And that it's sort of like an axe hanging over your head. Yeah, okay, it's not actually at your neck, it's not lethal next turn, but it's a shadow of a threat constantly hanging over you, so you constantly feel like you're under pressure. The reason that's important is because there are cards in this release which I think further press that. Cards which are not themselves a threat, but which are a shadow of a threat. Just like, you go back to Zilliax of old, where Zilliax didn't care what it had on the board. If it ever had a single minion on the board, it always had the threat of just double power overwhelming Soulfire. right? You know, spontaneous 12 burst from hand. And the issue wasn't the random 1/1 they had on the board. It was the fact that it was a body that was capable of attacking, that they can buff an insane amount, or that they can use to trade into your 3/5 taunt. It's just like, oh, I'm going to trade my 1/1 Divine Shield. I'm going to Abusive Sergeant it twice, so it's a 5/1, and then I'm going to trade it into your 4 mana 3/5 taunt. That's harsh. And all just to make the point that I think the third and probably the most necessary lens for looking at new cards is to say, what archetype do these cards fit into? Or what family of cards do they share other spots with? I will use really quick as an example it was sort of like aggro mid-range shaman from, what was it called? League of Explorers. So after Tunnel Trog got released, most importantly. The issue with that deck was not any one particular card, right? 4 mana 7/7 wasn't really that big of a problem. The issue was that it was following up Tuskar Totemic. Tuskar Totemic wasn't 100% completely nutso. It's that it was following up Totem Golem, which was in turn following up Tunnel Trog. And so that's the thing. You pick any one card in that package, and it's pretty good. Tunnel Trog especially is like 1 mana 1/3. 1 mana 1/3s are a problem, especially 1 mana 1/3s that grow are a problem, just sort of in general. But if there were no good overload cards for Shaman to play on 2 or 3, you would most likely have the ability to deal with a Tunnel Trog before it became a major problem. The issue was that you Tunnel Trog on 1, then you play a Totem Golem on 2, which both buffs the Trog and provides a good body for protecting the Trog. So each of these cards in this set, or in that deck, were individually, I'm going to say, fairly strong, but when you put them together, they became a massive problem. I will go so far as to include, I want to use like actually Thunderbluff Valiant as the perfect example of this, where Thunderbluff Valiant was very strong in that deck, but I think if you reprinted Thunderbluff Valiant right now, I don't think that card would see play. 5 mana 3/6 that realistically you only want to play on 7 alongside your hero power, that's not that good. The issue was that it was the crowning piece. It was like the combo finisher to the 1, 2, 3, 4 that deck liked to play. It was not itself a ridiculously good card. In fact, I think it was mild. I think Thunderbluff Valiant was merely above average. The issue was that in the narrative of the rest of that deck, it was an extremely powerful card in terms of being, you know, a token generator plus increasing the threat on those tokens, etc., etc., etc. And that's my point, is I'm going to be looking out mostly for cards like Thunderbluff Valiant, which by themselves might seem completely innocuous, but if you realize that if you put those in the narrative of a certain type of deck that is coming together, it becomes a problem. And that, again, that's what I'm going to be looking at. And I do think the largest offender here is going to be Upgradeable Framebot, which I will cover when we get to that. But yeah, that's going to be primarily my psychology in evaluating these cards. I'm really going to focus on that third one, which is saying, what would you have to print to go along with the card in order for it to be completely nutty? And I'm not talking about even tribe synergies. Like, if you printed a 3 mana 4/4 mech, this would be completely nutty, because then you would have a 3 mana 5/9 charge on 3, and that's completely unfair. I'm not talking about something like that. I'm talking about the ability to generate tokens and constantly have bodies on the board. You could also look at, there was an aggro hunter that really depended on Alley Cat, because you would play Alley Cat on 1, and you'd basically always have a body for Crackling Razor Maw to hit on 2. And that was a very big deal. Consistently having a Crackling Razor Maw target on 2 was a huge deal. So Alley Cat, 2/1/1s isn't that good. but it is really good because Crackling Razor Maw exists. And that's sort of my point, is, again, looking at some of these cards and going, if another thing exists, this card could be extremely problematic, and even frankly, overwhelmingly problematic. So that's going to be my primary narrative for looking at cards. Alright, so all of that said, let's go ahead and get to the cards themselves. I'm going to start by looking at the neutral cards, mostly because in order to build a narrative for each class, in order to look at the cards in a narrative, you need to have the entire narrative. So we're going to talk about the neutrals first, and then we'll go on and talk about each class specifically and individually. Alright, so starting with Whizbang the Wonderful. You start the game with one of Whizbang's wonderful decks. 4 mana, 4/5. Great, it's a Yeti. Nobody cares about playing this, actually playing this card. You know, you play it on turn 4. Okay. When you put this guy in your deck, it replaces your hero as well as your deck, and every time you queue up into a game, you will be allotted one of 18 random decks. And those 18 decks are all of the ones that show, it's 2 per class, of all of the deck recipes that Blizzard releases for the expansion. So there will be 2 Warrior decks, 2 Paladin decks, so on and so forth. This clearly is the Welcome to the Game card, right? This is the new user or new player experience card. This bypasses the fact that you start the game, you start brand new into the game, rank 25, no collection, nothing but commons and base cards, and you just get your face smashed in with people that have 10,000 dust decks or whatever, right? This card is pretty clearly designed to circumvent that and give people an idea of what they help new players get an idea of what they like playing, what sort of craft direction they want to go into, stuff like that. I don't think this has any ladder potential. Because, I mean, in general, I feel like the Hearthstone recipe decks are strong and fair, and ladder is not a place for fair decks. You basically have unfair decks going up against each other constantly. That's basically the idea, is be as unfair as possible. And the Hearthstone recipe decks just they're too fair. They're not unfair enough. I'm actually all of a sudden super curious if you can draft this guy in Arena, which would be hilariously unfair, because I have seen, like, passing images of the deck recipes, and those would be ridiculously unfair to take into Arena. But yeah, generically, this is a new player experience card. Great. I think that's awesome. Getting on to Zilliax, the 5-mana legendary magnetic mech. I'm not going to cover magnetic. I'm sure all of you have seen what that does already. Divine Shield, Taunt, Lifesteal, Rush. Now, there's a couple things about this. A lot of people have talked about this as like, oh, the mech Alec here, right? I mean, no Wind Fury. It's Rush, not Taunt. Or I'm sorry, Rush, not Wind Fury. And it has Lifesteal. Now, here's the thing about this, is I personally feel like the biggest advantage of magnetic is that you get charge on whatever it is you're playing. Like, I'm going to skip ahead for a minute and look at Wargear. This is a 5-mana 5/5. In Arena, that's fine. It's a vanilla 5/5, whatever. The thing is, if you attach this to something, I don't know if one of these will exist, but let's just say you've got a random 1/1 mech on the board, right? If you play a vanilla 5/5 mech, it's like, sure, whatever. That's not constructed level power. It's like fine in Arena. But if you attach this to a 1/1, that's suddenly a basically 6/6 charge minion, and that is ridiculously more powerful than a vanilla 5/5. And I'm going to talk about this a lot when I get to basically the Upgradeable Framebot here and the Wargear a little bit more, talking about how I expect magnetic to be a problem. But I'm going to have to touch on that for this, which is to say that I think the most ridiculously overpowered thing about magnetic is the fact that it gives charge to whatever is magnetizing. Therefore, having Rush on this card is pretty meh, The only time in which you get rush value is when you attach this to something that you want to play that turn. And it's a 2-card combo, one of which is a legendary, and therefore you only have 1 copy of. Now, the biggest problem with this, I think, is how Silence interacts with Magnetic. Because, and I've been doing a little bit of reading on this, nobody really knows what the answer, what the answer is right now. But essentially the question is, what happens if you silence a minion that has been magnetized? Like, that's a massively important thing, because when you look at this card, you know, the Divine Shield Taunt Lifesteal Rush is where most of its value comes from, but I don't think you can overlook the 3-2 in stats. And I think if you can just silence this off, it's underwhelming. It's too much of a silence target. In general, anything that's been magnetized is assuming that when it gets silenced, it also loses the stats. Anything that's magnetized is a huge silence target in the first place, so then adding on all of this extra stuff, the Divine Shield Taunt Lifesteal, is just too much. It's too situational. So I don't think this is a good card. I don't think basically it is both an early game or early mid game defensive tool against aggro decks. If that's I think you could print an horrors for this. It's a late game pseudo threat against the control of those, and like that is an hypothetically awesome flexible card playable. I can't think of what that would be right off the top of my head. But I think I don't know if this will see constructed play. I think a lot of this depends on what the meta looks like. As sort of a surprise threat. How magnetic works say it's out quite a bit. I wouldn't say that it's surprisingly better. I wouldn't say it's enough better than other things. Like a 4-mana 12/6 do the same thing as long as you're on turn 10. I don't think it's a better threat than other threats that already exist. So I don't. What do I feel like the restrictions are to this? I actually want to talk about if we're in a meta. I feel like this is so aggro, easier to talk about. I think this card is fantastic. That the 6 health doesn't mean anything. Now, I'm a little bit biased. In the past, I have had a real love for hybrid decks or decks that had cards that will not in more than one way. Probably this card is absolutely fantastic in that regard. I think in the meta arenas, this would, if you're in arena, you have this in your opening hand, you get to turn 4. Then I have to wonder, because it's to attack, would you in arena, like tempo matters. It's interesting how this card, plus it sort of has a hard counter, and then if you play 4-mana 2/6 is your opponent, if it's a priest, they Shadow Word retain it. 4-mana 2/6 is pretty actually sort of curious if stalling out the game if you're a control deck against an aggressive deck, take like. So maybe that's a hard limit on keeping this from ever being too good. A control versus control but the matchup. Thing that makes me wonder about the really interesting thing to me is that in control versus control, there's the question of that matchup. But I suspect, and bear in mind, I'm not talking about, or I should say, I'm afraid, but in just like a generic we are going to be entering. Take Big Mage versus Big Mage, Big Spell Mage, I suppose, versus Big Spell Mage, or the traditional just control warlock with void lords. I'm afraid that if this expansion is too good at doing whatever to do, my goal is just to live forever. Then I'll play Rin, I'll destroy your deck, and it plays a little bit like a fatigue deck almost. In those matchups, in this not being a mech is a huge deal. The person who wins is, I find, usually the person who runs out of threats first. I think this has to be. You can play it on 4. If you're a control deck going up against an aggressive deck, and your best win condition is to not die by turn 6, this helps you accomplish that goal of not dying by turn 6. If you're against a control matchup, this card says, hold on to me until turn 10, and have an extra set of threats. And that's fantastic. So this would also be an interesting addition to Quest Warrior, actually, because one of the things Quest Warrior basically says, hey, my goal is to play taunts, survive to the end game, and then smash all your stuff repeatedly with a 2-mana deal 8 damage hero power. That deck doesn't have very many threats outside of Sulfuris plus hero power. If you add into that this card, which can be played on 4 in order to progress the quest, or can be played after 10 in order to be a threat in the form of just a 12/6 to go along with your hero power. I think that's awesome. I actually think we will see this. I think this is a very strong card in Quest Warrior. I don't know if we'll see Quest Warrior. I don't know if that will fit in the meta. There's always people sort of working to make it fit because it's a popular deck. But I think this is an amazing card in Quest Warrior now that I mention it. So I do think this will see at least a little bit of play. I don't know how it will fit into other decks. Sort of has to do with what the meta is doing, obviously, and whether or not this has enough hard counters. I guess the thing I'm going to say about this is that historically, low attack, high health taunts have been the best in the form of, like, well, 4 mana 2/6s, you know, Tortolan Shellraiser, the new, what's it called, the Angry Etten with the 7 mana 5/9. Like categorically, you want way more health than attack on your taunts. But because of the magnetic mechanic, which can potentially bestow charge on very large volumes of stats, I think that will start to be less true, right? Because, like, if you play, say you put an Omega Defender on the board, a 2/6, and your opponent has one of these on the board, and then magnetizes a Wargear to it, this becomes a 6/10, and it's a 6/10 with charge. So it's going to run into your Omega Defender, and it's going to be a 6/8 and kill your Omega Defender in one shot. And that's pretty brutal. So I think in the current meta, this is an extremely good card. I think in the meta that's to come, that has the danger of large volumes of charging stats, low attack, high health taunts aren't going to be as effective. Alright, so next I'm going to talk about Upgradeable Framebot. Now I'm coming back to re-record this segment. My original segment on this got pretty long and rambly, and I made a lot of good points, but it was just way too long and there was no way to do it cleanly. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because there's a lot of points to make. First, I can understand why Blizzard would print this card, because if you're saying, hey, we want to do this magnetic mechanic, and we want people to be able to utilize it, well, in order to utilize magnetic, you need to have something on the board. Therefore, you need to print a sticky mech. Excuse me. You need to print a sticky mech to magnetize something to. So you're like, great. We need some sort of low-cost sticky card, just to give people the ability to consistently play their magnetic cards. Okay, I understand that. On defense, playing control deck against an offensive deck, but specifically I'm looking at Odd Paladin. This is a fine card. The 1 health, or the 1 attack, 5 health is very favorable. Lets you just continuously poke into tokens and help keep your opponent's board clear, like removing the phantom of threats that I talked about before, like the axe over your head problem. But my issue with this card is the exact same issue that caused Tar Creeper to be printed in the way that it was. That right before printing Tar Creeper, you know, the issue was, how do you print a card that is overstated for defensive control decks, but only average statted for offensive decks, so that what we're trying to design as a defensive tool isn't co-opted to be a ridiculously overpowered offensive tool. Putting this in that category, this is a 2-mana card with 6 stats. That's ridiculous. We've already heard the complaints about overstated 1-cost minions and ridiculously strong 1-drops. This card scares me from a zoo perspective, because anytime we have low mana cost sticky minions, they are almost categorically co-opted for aggressive zoo-type decks. I mean, this is 100% the mole, the Dire Mole effect. 1 attack, 3 health. Aggro Rogue runs Dire Mole because it's sticky and because you can cold-blood it, right? The point is, low attack, high health minions seem like they ought to be defensive cards. And I think this is a fundamental issue that Blizzard is not understanding about cards, is that low attack, high health cards seem like they ought to be defensive cards. But it's actually exactly the opposite. because an incredibly sticky minion is difficult to remove. So if you combine this with War Leader, Abusive Sergeant, Cold Blood, any kind of buff whatsoever, this card is nuts, right? This, like, if you combine this with a 3-mana Magnetic 2/2, this becomes a 3/7. That's way not only that, it's charge. And this is the thing, magnetic minions are essentially be played as a vanilla minion or be played as a buff. And if this is a target to receive a buff, what are the best minions to give buffs to? Categorically, sticky minions. So hey, let's print an extra sticky, low mana cost card that has ridiculous buffs you can hand to it. That's an overwhelming aggro tool. I highly suspect we will see this in things like aggro rogue. It might disrupt the odd rogue. I'm not sure if there's enough good two cost cards in rogue to justify breaking the odd rogue paradigm. Maybe Eviscerate makes it, but like cold blooding this scares me. Direwolf alpha-ing this scares me. You know, you go Firefly, coin Firefly into this, and then some sort of AoE buff, or like a Paladin Hammer that gives plus attack, or anything to that effect. I think this is a very dangerous card in the hands of aggro. So yeah, from a design perspective, we need a low-cost sticky minion in order to let people magnetize, sure. From a defensive perspective, helps you ping off tokens, awesome. From an aggro perspective, it's incredibly problematic in being overstatted, way too sticky, and the receiver of buffs, right? If you turn, I mean, let's pretend there's a 3-mana 3/3 equivalent of Wargear. Then then on turn 3, you have a 4/8 charge. That's not fun. That absolutely feeds into an aggro meta. The one counterpoint I want to make to that is that, hilariously, there is a card that is both a good substitution to this and a direct counter to it, which is Scorpomatic. So I think if we get into a world where people start playing this as an offensive card, we'll start seeing Scorpomatic basically in the Hungry Crab / Galaka Crawler type of idea. We'll start seeing Scorpomatic as just a tech card against this card, which does sort of put it in check, but has, and furthermore, has the benefit of also being a mech that you can magnetize things to. So in a zoo type, if this pushes a meta where early, sticky, zooey type minions are on the board and are getting buffed to do aggro things, we'll also probably then wind up in a situation where whoever sticks the first mech wins. So, you know, if it's zoo versus zoo, sort of revolving around this card, and one person plays this on 2, and the other person Scorpomatics this, not only did the first person to play their Upgradeable Framebot lose theirs and all of the tempo that goes with it, but the second player has also consequently put a mech on the board, which is a substitute for the Framebot they would have put on the board while also removing yours. So I think if this pushes that meta, we will also see 2 copies of Scorpomatic coming into the game, both as a counter and as a substitution to this card. Are there any other points I need to make there? Aggro, defense, design perspective. I think that covers it. Flip side, Wargear. 5-mana 5/5 magnetic. It's a vanilla 5/5, which is not good enough for constructed, but actually, let's talk about Arena for a second. It's 5-mana 5/5, which is fine. You know, it's a fine mana fine. You look at like Stranglethorn Tiger, loses stealth. Sure, whatever. Not fantastic, but it's fine. The thing that's scary about it is that because it's magnetic, if you ever actually manage to attach it to something, it's completely unfair. There is one thing about this card that I find extremely scary, and it's sort of the counterpoint to everything I guess maybe the perfect example of everything I just said about how mechs giving each other charge is completely unfair. And I feel like I'm scared. I don't want to vocalize this because I don't want to see it. I want to go as long as possible without seeing this in a deck, because I think it's horrific. When I was thinking about reviewing how I was going to review this card, I had this idea and I was just like, that sounds extremely toxic. I don't want to play against it. Should I add it in a review? And the thing is, I think this is a case where I'd rather go for accuracy over trying to protect my game playing experience. So the thing that scares me is having Odd Paladin add Harvest Golem plus this. Harvest Golem on 3, coin Wargear it in an aggro deck. That sounds awful. Especially because Harvest Golem is so resilient, right? If you don't kill the first body, it becomes a 7-8 charge. Turn 4, 7-8 charge in an aggro deck. Fun. Or, alternatively, you kill the first body, but the 2/1 manages to stick around because you just don't have that many tools for dealing damage. And instead it's a turn 4, 7-6 charge. I kind of want to vomit thinking about Odd Paladin with mech synergy or magnetic mechs really makes me sick. And this is absolutely the personification of what I think the problem is going to be with magnetic, is that it really, really pushes an aggro meta. It really says, if you have a mech on the board, I won't say win the game, but be a massive threat. Not only are you playing against Paladin saying, crap, I need to constantly keep his 1/1s off the board because they threaten getting leveled up or whatever. It's just a massive problem. Not only that, if he puts a mech on the board, suddenly you're like, that is also a massive threat. Not because of what it is right now, but because of the fact that it can be magnetized to charge huge amounts of damage into my face. So the entire magnetic principle, to me, really pushes aggro, and I am afraid of seeing a resilient mech in Paladin that can be magnetized to in order to give charge to large volumes of stats. That legitimately scares me, and I suspect it's going to be a whole lot of not fun, and I'm already sort of brainstorming against Odd Paladin, running exactly that combo. And you have to keep my board clear at all times, because at any time, if something survives, I'm just going to make it a monster minion, and you won't be able to deal with it. And I don't really feel like that's a fun mechanic. Like, maybe to a limited extent. Like, it irritates me that Paladin is that way, but I'm okay with it for now. But to add more things like that kind of makes me want to throw up. So, anyway, those are the neutral cards. So move on to the class specials, and the class cards. We won't have as much to say about these just because there's less of them, and there's obviously not that much narrative to interact with. I want to do the single cards at a time. Rogue, legendary spell. Draw the rest of your deck. 5 mana. I think this is a bad card. Let me compare this to actually the two other decks that do this same kind of thing. Let's talk about Quest Shaman, right? Quest Shaman is play 10 Murlocs, summon 10 Murlocs, and then you get Megafin. And Megafin says when you play it, Battle Cry. When you play it, fill your hand with random Murlocs. Essentially what that does is it says you should play aggro. You should play Murloc aggro, because that's the only thing Murlocs are good for. But the problem with playing Murlocs is that you run out of cards by turn 5 or 6, and if you haven't won by then, you just lose, because then you're drawing 1 card a turn, and that's not good enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a second wave of Murlocs so that you have sustain power up through turn 10. So basically, play Murlocs, play aggro, but we're going to give you enough Murlocs to play to keep up the pressure until turn 10 instead of until turn 5. This card does that, but worse. Because Quest Shaman that quest starts in your hand, and this is a one of. And if you don't build a deck around this, it's terrible. If you build a deck around this, it's only a one of in your deck, and if you don't draw it, you lose the game. And that's basically why I think this is trash. Because I don't see any world where you build a deck around this and it's consistent, because you only have one copy of this in your deck. It has the Aluneth problem where if you just don't draw it, you just lose the game. Let's do Hunter. Now, this Hunter, Magnetic Mech, Spider Bomb, 3 mana, 2/2. Magnetic, Death Rattle, destroy a random enemy minion. This was one of the first cards to be released for review. But I do have to retcon something I said before. I have to appreciate that this feels more like a defensive card to me. Which means maybe somebody somewhere was paying attention to the fact that a 2 mana 1/5 that gives things charge is a huge problem if the things it gives charge to has high attack. So this obviously isn't good as a vanilla minion. Is this a problem as a magnetic minion? Is this a problem if we attach it to a 2 mana 1/5, turning it into a 3/7 with charge? Turn 3, 3/7 charge, Death Rattle, destroy a random enemy minion. A little bit. That's not grossly unfair. If it was 4/7, it would be grossly unfair. 3/7 is right on the fence for me. But even then, that means this card is only potentially good as a buff on another card, which means you have to have both that card in your hand by turn 2 and this card in your hand by turn 3. I don't think that's good synergy. But let's put that in the narrative of what Hunter usually does. Does a 3 mana 3/7 charge in Hunter sound like a problem? Yes. I think it's dangerous in hypothetically pushing a face Hunter type thing. I think this could be part of a package. I think the Upgradeable Framebot plus this is one piece of a package that could be extremely oppressive and unfun. So we'll put it that way. Paladin, also one card, Magnetic, Divine Shield, Taunt. I don't think this is good. For Mage, because this is also one card. Now, I've played a ton of Mage. So I was excited to see the Mage Legendary, but I'm a little bit sad about this card, just because it's very niche. And how niche it is does something both very interesting and something potentially problematic. Now, let me pull this up to full size. 3 mana, 2/4. That's not good. You don't play this for its stats. It has not good enough early game presence. It's not flexible in that regard. Like, you can't put this in your deck and say, I can play it on turn 3 if I need to in order to battle against an aggro deck. Not really. It's not good enough for that. You would want your lone champions and Dark Reapers for those tools. That being said, the only thing this card is good for is as a draw engine. Now, here's the trouble with that. There are much less awkward draw cards in the game. I'm thinking Arcane Intellect and Novice Engineer, because Cold Light Oracle has rotated out. Here's the thing. Draw. Okay, first of all, you would use less clunky draw before you used this card. If you had a deck that needed a little bit of draw in it, you'd use a less clunky card than this. If you have a deck that needs a lot of draw in it, like, that's almost certainly going to be a combo deck, because pretty much categorically, combo decks just need draw, right? Now, here's the question. What are the traditional combo mage decks, and are they lacking draw? And I feel like the pinnacle of combo mage deck is Exodia. So I'm going to use Exodia as an example. Now, I did like playing Exodia Mage. It was one of my favorites. I appreciated how it was technical, though I was sad because it's a non-interactive deck, and that feels like bad game design to me. It feels like you're basically playing solitaire, and that's not fun for your opponent. But I also recognize that playing solitaire and removing your opponent's deck from the equation of whether you win or not is a good strategy for winning, right? Removing your deck, removing your opponent as a variable to whether you win or not is a great idea. So it was an effective deck, and I really liked it in terms of winning, but I also sort of don't appreciate it in that it's not interactive or fun. But it was technical and clever as well. But that's just a side story. This card. Now, I'm going to try and plug this card into Exodia just to make my point, because Exodia is the perfect example of a combo deck, right? Draw your pieces, instantly win the game. Exodia lost a lot of, Exodia Mage lost a lot of things over the last rotations. They lost Ice Block, which saves you a couple of turns, right? Ice Block essentially says you get 2 free turns of draw, plus possibly more if you discover more. In a weird way, you could almost say Ice Block says restart your turn. 3 mana, restart your turn. So regain 10 mana, draw a card. In a weird way. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's a bad way of looking at it. But anyway, one of the things Exodia Mage lost was Cold Light Oracles, which lists were a little bit different. There were some that ran, I believe the tradition was to run either two Cold Light Oracles and one Novice Apprentice, or 2 Novice Apprentice and 1 Cold Light Oracle, which was my preference. They lost Cold Light Oracle, and that's 4 cards, and that's a big deal. And we didn't... Oh, they also ran 2 Arcane Intellects, right? So that's... Let's see, you've got draw to draw you 2 Arcane Intellects is 4, 2 Cold Light Oracles is 8, 1 Novice Apprentice was 9... Or, I'm sorry, Novice Engineer was 9, and then hopefully your 2 Arcanosmiths, not Arcanosmith. Well, what's the name of that card? I feel dumb that I've forgotten it. It's the 2 mana 2/3 that draws you a secret. Ideally, that draws you something as well. So in that case, you would have 11 cards of draw, right? Now they lost the 2 Cold Light Oracles, which pulls them down to 7. You could maybe substitute in Loot Hoarders to bring it back up to 9, but still you're missing some draw. And on top of that, the fact that you don't have Ice Block to prolong the game makes that even worse. So the lack of... You not only lost draw, but you lost stall. And the way to make up for losing stall is to get more draw, not less. So there's actually... It's actually pretty bad. Now you could, if you lost Ice Block, you could supplement it with extra Arcanologist. That's what I'm looking for. You could supplement. You could supplement your lack of stall with extra draw as long as you have time to do it. But here's the thing about this card. I'm really curious as to what the order of resolution is. Because if you put this in a deck that is extremely greedy about drawing cards, if you're just like, I need to draw as many cards as quickly as possible to get to my combo pieces, like Exodia. If you're just like, I want every piece of draw I can possibly get my hands on, then you don't include this first. You include this because there are no other better draw options that you have. That means you're going to be running this with other draw cards. How do draw cards interact with this? Let me give you an example. If you have this on the board and your rightmost card is Novice Engineer, and you play the Novice Engineer, do you draw 1 card or 2? Because traditionally, in the past, if you look at things that say when you play a card, blah, those effects happen after the entirety of the card resolves. So for example, Shadow Reaper Anduin says when you play a card, reset your hero power. You'll notice when you play that card, all of its effects resolve before it unflips its hero power. Before it unflips your hero power. Here's my question. Is that an order of operations that is accurately represented, or is that just animation? And that is super important, because here's the thing. If you have a Novice Engineer on the right and you play it, you have played your rightmost card, but Battle Cry, you draw a card. There is now a new card in your hand that's position is or would have been to the right of Novice Engineer. Then the card hits the board, and any when you play a minion effects trigger. And then, as far as I can tell, any when you play a card effects trigger, such as resetting the Shadow Reaper Anduin hero power. So if this checks for whether you played the rightmost card in your hand after Battle Cry's trigger, this has strong anti-synergy with other draw cards. And that's awful, because this is a clunky draw card, which means you would only run it if you had no other better options for draw. And if you're that desperate for draw, including adding a draw card that has anti-synergy with your other draw cards is bad. It's just bad. But on the flip side, if this would draw you 2 cards in the form of, hey, Novice Engineer was the card on the right, so Battle Cry triggers, you draw a card, but at the time that you played it, before the Battle Cry triggered, it was the right-hand card in your hand. So we're going to draw you another card. Then you actually get a little bit of draw synergy. Not 100%, because you draw 2 cards and maybe the second to the right card. So the first card that you drew of the 2 that you get. If you got 2 cards, and the first one you drew was another draw card that you wanted to play, you're out of luck, because it's not on the right anymore. But yeah, so it's like, the question is, does this synergize with cards that draw you cards? It's the same problem with Arcanologist, where if you play a 2-mana 2/3 that draws you a secret from your deck, does that secret add to your hand as a result of the Battle Cry? And then it checks, and then it says, oh, you played a card. Was it the rightmost card in your hand? No, because there was a secret on the right-hand side. That's anti-synergy, and it's terrible. And that makes me sad. However, there are weird, clunky edge cases where this could be better than that. A lot of people made the example of, like, Echo cards. Let's say, as an Exodia mage, you're looking for more stall options, and you decide that a good option for that is, like, Phantom Militia, right? If you, on turn 9, went Stargazer Luna, Phantom Militia, say Phantom Militia wasn't on the right, you don't draw a card. But the Echo adds to the right-hand side of your hand. Then you play it, and you draw a card because it was on the right. In that case, you gain 2 mana, you gain 2 2/4 taunts, and a 2/4 that's kind of a draw threat that your opponent has to deal with. If you're Exodia and this is on your board and your opponent doesn't remove it, he's an idiot. Which interestingly makes it a threat. But it's behind 2/4 taunts, so But then again, that's a 9-mana play, so right? Then you get Mossy Horde and you're sad. But yeah, anything that has like an echo effect or also generates a card. Funny example, if you're playing Exodia and you opt for, obviously you're going to want to do things that generate spells. Every time you generate a spell, it adds to the right-hand side of your hand. So if you go, let's say you Primordial Glyph into something, right, that you want to play. Let's say it's your turn. You're on a bunch of mana, say 8, and you let's say 10. I'm just making a number up, just for the sake of example here. If you go Stargazer Luna, Primordial Glyph, and you find something that costs 2 or less, making it free, that adds to the right-hand side of your hand. You play it, you draw a card. Then you play a Ghostly Conjurer for 4. That adds a spell to your hand that you need in order to complete your quest. That adds to the right-hand side of your hand. You play it. Draws you a card. right? You put up a 2/4, a 2/6, 2/0/2 taunts, you've drawn 2 cards, and you've progressed your quest by 2. It's pretty decent for an Exodia turn, unless you're under a ton of pressure. So you kind of see what I'm saying? Like, there's worlds in which this could help. This could bring back... The short version, this is a combo mage card. You play it in a card, you play it in a deck where you're just so overwhelmingly greedy for card draw. If this has anti-synergy with other card draw, you don't play this. If it has synergy with other card draw, maybe it has a place in a combo mage deck. The only other example I can think of is some sort of like cheap spell burn mage, where, you know, if you've got Stargazer Luna on the board and you do arcane missiles from the right hand side of you draw an arcane missiles, you're like, sure, 1 mana, missile 3 times, draw a card. You draw a Cinderstorm, you play that, draw a card, draw a Cinderstorm, play that. And you just sit there drawing and playing missile cards for cheap, or primordial glyphs, or whatever. This is even more aggravated by extremely spell-heavy decks where you have managed to stick Sorcerer's Apprentices. If you do, like... I'm actually kind of thinking now, what if you did Stargazer Luna, Sorcerer's Apprentice, Molten Reflection. That's 2, 4, 6, 7, 10 mana. Yeah. That costs you 10 mana. It's a full 10 mana saturated turn. All of your spells are discounted by 4. If you ever draw a spell that costs 4 or less, you play it for free, and it draws you the next card. So if those are like, if you literally only have 2 Sorcerer's Apprentices, Stargazer Luna, and 30 spells, and 25 spells that cost 4 or less, yes, you could mill your deck at someone. As long as you got exactly those 5 cards in your hand by turn 10. And I do think that would be hilarious. I might try and put together that clip just as a highlight, just like constant 4 mana spells. Draw a card, play it, draw a card, play it, draw a card, play it. Except I'm not sure there aren't that many spells that cost 4 or less, so I'll have to find some other way to resolve that. Obviously, if you have... No, there's ways around that. You could include spells that cost more than 4. It's just that if you ever drew them so that they were on the right-hand side, you'd have to draw past them, right? If you pick up a spell, like, let's say, Dragon's Fury, reduced by 4. It's now on the right-hand side of your deck, costs 1. You have 0 mana. The only way to draw more cards from Luna is to cast something from the right. What you could do is, if you had like an Arcane Intellect in hand, you could play that, which would draw you past the Dragon's Fury on the right-hand side of your deck, and possibly draw you back to something that costs 4, which would let you continue the combo. But, anyway. Point being, you could maybe do like a really silly Machine Gun Mage type thing that would not be good. It would be silly, but it wouldn't be good. Or this will have anti-synergy with other draw mechanics, and it will see no play in combo mage, in any kind of a combo mage. Or it will have positive synergy with draw mechanics, and it might see play in a combo mage, depending on what sort of draw engine they want to go for, and or how desperate they are for more draw. Something like Exodia that's just like, give me all the draw. And even then, I'm talking about the quest version of Exodia rather than the elemental leyline manipulator one, which actually is actually sort of like a hybrid of them, but that's another story. I'll talk about that later. All right, moving on. Not Druid. We have... Let's do Warrior. Beryllium Nullifier. 7 mana, 3/8, magnetic, can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. I think it's a bad card. A vanilla 7 mana, 3/8 is terrible. You compare this to, like, a War Golem, which doesn't see play. You know, it's 7 mana, 14 stats. It's a 7/7. Compare that to this. 7 mana, 11 stats? Seriously? The Shroud effect, can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, is stronger on minions that are aggressively statted. The reason for, like, you know, like 6 attacks, 3 healths or something like that. Because the thing that makes you sad about playing a 6/3 is having your opponent remove it for 1 or 2 mana. If you play a 4 mana 6/3 and your opponent frostbolts it for 2, and then has 2 mana left over to gain tempo on you, you're sad. But a 6/3 with Shroud is fantastic, because that's a big threat of hitting your opponent's face, and they don't have any way of responding to it. As a 7 mana magnetic, I mean, like, let's hypothesize you attach this to what's it called? Let's say you attach it to an upgradable Framebot, right? So it becomes a 9 mana 4/13. Great. You're gonna sit there and poke your opponent for 6 turns, right? Like, it's just not enough. Supercollider. I think this card is awesome. A lot of people have made the point that stuff like forcing a poisonous minion to attack its neighbor is busted. It auto-kills it. Plus, on top of that, most poisonous minions have low attack, so you're not taking much return damage when you hit something with this. You know, let's say you hit, what's a good example? A Venomancer, and it turns next to its neighbor and kills a Mountain Giant. For taking 2 damage, you've killed a Venomancer and a Mountain Giant. That's pretty good. I don't know. This is a weird one to judge, just because it helps you get a lot for things like Handlock, or I guess it's Even Lock now, playing out Mountain Giants. It helps you a lot for clearing taunts that are in your way, for doing favorable trades. You know, if your opponent's like, oh, I have a big board of stuff, and I'm going to put a taunt in front of it. You're just like, well, I'm going to hit your taunt and make it kill something else. And then your taunt's out of the way, and I can now take favorable trades. I think this is a cool card. I really don't know how to estimate its power level, though. Shaman. Let's do Menacing Nimbus. Battlecry, add a random elemental to your hand. I really liked Kriparian's analysis of this, where he said this is a bad effect. Because the range, the thing is, it's a 2 mana 2/2, which is mediocre. But adding a random elemental to your hand is momentum. It's sustain, sort of like the Elven Minstrel effect, except you don't get to choose what you put in your hand. And that's a problem, because you could do anything from get Firefly to Kalimos Primal Lord, right? And if you're playing this, you already have elementals in your deck, so you're going to trigger Kalimos. You're going to have a second Kalimos. And that's a problem. Like, it makes it very inconsistent, right? Even if you built a deck and then looked at this card and said, I'm going to take all of the elementals and I'm going to put them in a pool and I'm going to average them out to figure out what the average minion I get from this is. Even if you did that, and planned around the minion you added to the elemental you added to your hand being whatever that minion is, I still think it's bad for the game, because your opponent can't play around it at all. In fact, as I say this, I think it's even worse, because giants are becoming elementals. At least Mountain, Molten, Molten's in Wild, so that doesn't count. Mountain and Sea Giant are elementals. I'm not sure if the others are. I think Snow Fury Elemental is a giant. Let me check. Snow Fury Giant is an elemental. So I'm just kind of like, the range is too big, and as a result, your opponent can't play around it, you might wind up with an 8/8 that costs 0, and you might wind up with a Firefly, a 1/2 that adds a 1/2 to your hand, and it's a problem. Your opponent, I don't think it's fun. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's interesting. I think you can put it in a family of cards that is similar to like Pyros, in that it's an early game card with an okay body that gives you sustain and card advantage to keep playing things. Pyros is predictable in terms of what it gives you. But in a lot of ways, if Pyros death rattled into a random elemental, it might even be better. Well, no. But it would still be fine, because the fact that your opponent didn't know what it death rattled into would be a thing. You could surprise people with it. You know, how good would a second Baron Geddon be in Elemental Mage? So I feel like this card by itself is not that big of a problem, but I do think it's in a family of cards that as a package can be a problem. You know, if we see other cards that add random stuff to your hand or discover an elemental, you know, Menacing Nimbus plus Servant of Kalimos sounds kind of bleh, right? Because your opponent is just constantly adding new powerful, more cards to their hand, more sustain, more things you have to answer. They don't directly have to play card draw. They just keep going and going and going and going, and it's frustrating. Electra Stormsurge. This is even worse, because this is an elemental. You can add it to your hand randomly off of Menacing Nimbus, or you can discover it off of Kalimos. Battlecry, your next spell this turn casts twice. How good is that? If it's like most spells that cast twice, where targets are chosen randomly, then you can't play it with a direct spell, right? If you do like, what's the name of this card? Electra Stormsurge into Lava Burst. It's not good. You might hit your opponent in the face the first time, but who knows what the heck's happening with the second Lava Burst. You might play it with something like Healing Rain just for massive sustain. I don't feel something like Feral Spirit is interesting, because then you get 4 2/3 spirits with taunt, but it's overload 4. I don't feel like there's really that many spells that you want to cast twice that are beneficial. I think this is situational. I suspect it won't be very good and won't see very much play, but I could be wrong. There could be spells that come out that make this card bonkers. All right, moving on. We have, lastly, Druid. I left Druid for last because I think there is an enormous problem here. Primarily in the form of Treants. But I'm going to leave that for last because I feel like it's the biggest, most complicated issue. Biology Project. Each player gains 2 mana crystals. Let's see. Turn 1, go to 2 mana. Play Wild Growth. Turn 2, have 4 mana. I think this is pretty good. I feel like this actually counterfeits aggro a little bit, because while you're handing aggro more mana, right, if you just magically start the game at 4 mana, the thing you've lost is 3 turns to hit your opponent in the face with your minions. Yeah, if you have 4 1-drops, that's pretty good for 1, 2, 3-ish. It's good-ish. But you have lost the 3 turns of hitting your opponent in the face with those cards. So I feel like accelerating both you and your opponent isn't bad. I think it's actually because it quote-unquote strips your opponent of 2 turns to hit you in the face. that it helps you quite a bit, because this is 2 turns sooner that you can play a Spreading Plague against your opponent's aggro, or even a swipe. You know, if you go turn 1 Biology Project, you now have 3 mana crystals, 2 of which are filled, and you can use to play minions. Turn 4, you can swipe. So, I mean, like, this opens up your mid-game quite a bit, but it's odd because, I mean, even then you can spend that 2 mana to Wild Growth, and then turn 2, you have 5 mana, and you can Nourish to 7. Then on turn 3, you're on 8. And that's pretty bonkers. Similarly, if you build a Biology Project deck and you don't get this card, how sad are you? I think pretty sad, because most likely you skip over 2 and 3 drops, because you know you're going to go pretty much straight to 4 and 5, and so you just skip your first 3 turns, and that's a little bit sad. So it might be that the inconsistency is dangerous for this card. I think there's enough other cards around this, like Wild Growth and whatnot, sort of in the same family of effects, that this fits in quite well and actually does fine in increasing the stability. I think this is a good card. I think there are places where, I think there are decks where this would get played. I think we can expect to see this card in some of those decks. Whether those decks are strong in the meta, I don't know. But I do feel like there are definitely Druid decks that are supported by this card. Flobbidinous Floop. It was funny, I was thinking about how to review this card, and I actually thought it was pretty trash, because I was putting it in the Fungalmancer category of stuff, where it's like after you play a minion. With Fungalmancer, after you play a minion, you summon an extra copy of it. Great. I think the short explanation for this card is pick a card, any card, in the entirety of Hearthstone, available to Druid. Pick a card available to Druid that instantly wins you the game if you could play it, if it's stuck on the board, or if you could play it for 4 mana instead of however much it costs. Classic example. Think of the Aviana Kun Malygos OTK thing that used to exist a while ago. Imagine you could play Aviana for 4. What's the effect of that, right? Like, the problem with that combo was that you would play Aviana, and then you can't just play Aviana out on the board. Your opponent would kill it. In this case, that's completely fine. You play the Aviana out, your opponent kills it, next turn you play a 4-mana Aviana, you know, Malygos for 1 to 5, you have 5 mana left to blow people up with. I actually want to take a quick look through my collection and ask myself that question. If Druid has any one card that sticks on the board for a turn and instantly wins the game, or can be played for 10 mana, or played for 4 mana, and instantly win the game, what is it? Maybe just Malygos and Aviana in Wild. So yeah, how does this affect Malygos Druid? I think this is actually a fantastic change for Malygos Druid. I don't think it's overpowered. I think it is exactly what that deck needed, because the trouble with Malygos Druid was you didn't have any cheap face spells outside of Moonfire, and the 12 damage just isn't enough, right? You're not like a rogue where you can be like Sinister Strike, Counterfeit Coin, Sinister Strike, Eviscerate for 24 damage, right? Think of this basically as a second Twig of the World Tree, almost. This is a second card that makes it possible to play Malygos along other cards. Previously, there was only one copy, Twig of the World Tree. You played Malygos, you pop the Twig, you have 10 mana. So that card ties 10 mana to Malygos. Flobbidinous Floop says, I will let you tie 6 mana to Malygos as long as I'm in your hand when you play Malygos. I think that's a fine effect. I think that doubles the consistency of this combo, and I think that's completely fine. Good, in fact, because Malygos Druid has vulnerabilities, but I think currently its biggest vulnerability is that it's very inconsistent and very vulnerable. And adding Flobbidinous Floop to that sort of addresses both of those without making the deck more powerful. Yeah, so I think this is a great card. That being said, I'm probably overlooking something. There might be a ridiculous combo that breaks the game, right? We'll see. I'm not thinking of it. There's just sort of a whisper in the back of my mind that says there might be one or two things that this could be used to absolutely break the game, and it would be not fun. But I don't know what that would be. Anyway. All right, so the very last thing we should talk about is what I'm basically just going to call the Treant package for Druid, which is these 3 cards. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, the idea of where a card fits in a package that it would be played with is an important part of how I evaluate cards. I might not have said that. I might have not specifically addressed it directly very much in this review evaluation video, primarily because it's a little bit difficult to be that thorough in a video without getting ridiculously long. I have touched on it a little bit, like particularly when talking about, there's new cards here now, Upgradeable Framebot, talking about how I think this fits into potentially a package of cards that is extremely problematic. Now, and along that category, these 3 cards are directly a package. You can't really independently evaluate any one of these cards. They are all 3 together a package. And as a result, there's a lot to say about this. And there's really a lot I have to say about these cards. And it's going to take some time. I'm still sort of working out what all I want to say it, organizing my thoughts, how all I want to say it, still organizing my thoughts, pardon me. So I think I'm going to leave that off for another video, which I'll just probably call the Treant package. But for now, I just want to get something uploaded, get my thoughts so far, and then do this Treant package. And as you saw a little bit from scrolling over here, there are new cards released since I started this, so I will need to get on top of those. But yeah, that's my review so far. Looks pretty good. A couple of potential sleeper cards, but we'll have to see what else happens with the set and how things shift. But yeah, thanks for stopping in, and join me for the next one where we'll go over the Treant package. All right, everybody have a great day.